Thank you very much, Andrzej Nowak. My apologies for not being able to participate earlier in the conference. We have had technical problems and tried hard from our side to resolve them. But I think at the end it was Adam Milchik who helped me technically so that I can participate. So I open my presentation. It is kind of ongoing research, which I would like to present. So please keep this in mind. I start with some introductory remarks. So bringing you into the context of the Brest-Litovsk negotiations at the end of World War I. So the European public did not learn much about the armistice and peace negotiations that began in Brest-Litovsk at the end of November 1917. There was a great deal of interest because Europe was starving or longing for an end to the war, and these were the first official negotiations to end the war. So the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, had responded to the Bolsheviks' call for a so-called just peace after the October Revolution, in quotation marks, for peace, in quotation marks, without annexations and contributions, end of quote, whereas the Entente powers, especially England and France, did not. So the Central Powers, especially the leading Germans, strove for quick armistice and peace agreement in order to end the war on two fronts and to be able to win the war on the Western Front militarily. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, still hoped for the participation of the Entente in order to conclude a general peace and to be able to act as a revolutionary peace force. The public in East Central Europe was also interested in the negotiations, but their political representatives were not invited to the negotiations because they did not represent states. The negotiations were, however, to a large degree about the territories in which they lived. So in brief, the political context of the event that I would like to talk about here. As a result, the Central Powers concluded two peace treaties, one with Ukraine, February 9th, 1918, and another with Soviet Russia, March 3rd, 1918. But no stable and new political order in Eastern Europe emerged in Brest-Litovsk. In my talk, I'm looking for an answer to the question how political spaces were negotiated and created in Brest-Litovsk, and particularly by Soviet Russia, but also by the Central Powers and Ukraine. Western historiography of Brest-Litovsk, I believe it here with some brief remarks, has only recently made its first attempts to break down bilateral approaches, perspectives, and to paint a more comprehensive picture. And the lasting influence of Fritz Fischer and his school from the 1960s and 70s can still be felt in German historical research until today. Russian historical research now takes a distant view of Lenin's attempt to preserve the Soviet Russian state in Brest-Litovsk, and Ukrainian historical research focuses on the international recognition of the first modern Ukrainian state. So negotiation strategies had also a symbolic dimension, and one might argue that in Brest-Litovsk they came even first and emerged about the site of the negotiations. So you see Brest-Litovsk here. So Brest-Litovsk was not Paris or Vienna, but a rather unknown place. The Germans had designated the city and fortress of Brest-Litovsk as the venue for negotiations. It had belonged to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, It had been part of Russia since the partitions of Poland, Lithuania, in the interwar period of Poland, and is now located in Belarus on the border with Poland. The fortress of Brest-Litovsk was the headquarters of the Germans on the Eastern Front. The large fortress, built in the middle of the 19th century, together with the city, had come into German hands with the offensive of the Central Powers in 1915. It was connected to the railway network and thus reasonably accessible, even though the fortress and the city had been badly damaged in 1915. The Bolsheviks repeatedly demanded that the negotiations should be moved to another location and proposed Stockholm in neutral Sweden. In the spring and summer of 1917, a peace conference of the Second International had taken place in Stockholm. So the Bolsheviks believed that they could reach out much better to the international public in a large or capital city and could propagate the revolutionary idea of a so-called peace without annexations and contributions, and to use the negotiations for propaganda for a new socialist world order. For this reason, the Central Powers kept repeatedly rejecting the proposals. Until March 1918, the end of the negotiations, all parties to the negotiations felt the disadvantages of the place. The Brest-Litovsk railway station was not easy to reach. The telephone, telegraph, and telegram connections to Petrograd, Vienna, Berlin, Kiev, and other places were repeatedly interrupted or temporarily cancelled, so that the negotiations had to be interrupted, which could also take longer if the delegations went to their capitals and returned with new instructions back to Brest. Some negotiators, such as the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister von Czernin, also left the site as early as possible. The social opportunities were limited on site. It was almost impossible to avoid each other, and the negotiating delegations even had dinner together at first, until Lev Trotsky took over the leadership of the Soviet-Russian delegation in early January 1918, and instead of dining with the imperialists, preferred to sit and eat with his delegation separately and to work after dinner on a book manuscript in his room at night. This was not Vienna of 1814-15, at best an anti-Vienna. Little gossip reached the outside world, especially since the international press, journalists, and newspapers were largely absent. The Bolsheviks made it clear that two worlds met in this place, according to their view. The diplomacy of a new age, which supposedly knew no secrets, met the diplomacy of a bygone era. In short, Brest-Litovsk was a politically chosen place, chosen and determined by the Germans on conquered territory, and the Bolsheviks tried as best they could to seize this place. You have the delegations here coming or being at Brest-Litovsk. You have a statement by the head of the German delegation, Richard von Kühlmann, on the question of the dinner, because it has somehow a symbolic meaning in these negotiations. And here a quote by Leon Trotsky. And here my point to this kind of question. I'm coming to my second point. Under the global conditions at the end of World War I, especially the entry of the US into the war in spring of 1917 and the military situation on the Eastern Front, the peace negotiations in Brest-Litovsk led to territorial changes from Finland in the north to the South Caucasus, East Anatolian border region in the south. And you have two pictures, two photos, two maps showing you these border changes here. The spatial relationships have to be differentiated because they were hierarchical in nature. Former imperial and 1917, 18 still existing imperial spaces, as well as new or prefigured state spaces, overlapped, at least mentally. Especially on the former Western imperial periphery of the Tsarist Empire, declarations of autonomy and sovereignty were made after the collapse of the empire in early 1917. Under the conditions of military advance and occupation, the German negotiating side prevailed against the Bolsheviks in Brest-Litovsk in discussions on Finland, Estonia, Courland, Poland, and Ukraine. With regard to imperial spaces, I would put it this way. The former Western imperial periphery of Russia became the new Eastern sphere of influence of Imperial Germany. It migrated from an older sphere of influence to a new one for a short time in 1918. The South Caucasian East Anatolian border was also about imperial spaces or peripheries. Here, the negotiator of the Ottoman Empire, Talat Pasha, demanded successfully from Soviet Russia to get back the territories of Kars, Ardahan, and Batumi, which had passed from the Ottoman Empire to the Tsarist Empire in 1878. They had been previously part of the Ottoman Empire for several centuries and had not declared themselves sovereign after the collapse of Tsarist Empire in February 19. Representatives of Ukraine had been invited and admitted in Brest-Litovsk as the only representatives of a nation in the process of forming a state and emerging from the bankruptcy state of an empire, not from the beginning, however, but only during the ongoing negotiations. They rejected the right of the Soviet Russian representatives to talk about, quote, their territory and to take decisions about Ukrainian territories. The representatives of Germany and Austria-Hungary hoped to weaken Soviet Russia's negotiating position by officially opening negotiations with Ukraine at the beginning of January 1918. Ideological antagonisms did not matter. The Ukrainian delegates were socialists, but not Bolsheviks, and the Central Powers in this case pursued ideology-free power politics. Brest-Litovsk dynamized Ukraine's processes of territorialization and state building in a different way, because on the one hand, they dissolved a hierarchical spatial relationship with Russia, and on the other hand, they created a new non-imperial state space with the declaration of independence in January 1918 and the peace treaty of February 9, 1918, which set in motion other conflictual spatial relations in East Central Europe, in particularly with Poland. With the Ukrainian claim to the Polish-Ukrainian border region of Chelm, and a part of Podlasie, as well as the demand for the creation of a separate crown land, Eastern Galicia, Northern Bukovine, both of which were included in the treaty in the additional agreement and protocol, a new territorial conflict broke out even before the creation of an independent Poland in November 1918. In view of this mixed situation, it is surprising that, with one exception, there were no maps used for making territorial claims in Brest-Litovsk. The difference to the Paris peace negotiations a year later is striking, because there maps were part of the strategic arsenal of all parties present. They circulated in the conference public and during the negotiations, and geographers belonged to the entourage of delegations together with other experts. Not so in Brest-Litovsk. Only Major General Max Hoffmann, chief of the General Staff on the Eastern Front and representatives of the highest army, Oberste Heeresleitung, presented a map with a boundary line of the course of the front in the northern sector during the negotiations. You see it here. He repeatedly asked his negotiating partners for maps to mark political borders and advised the Ukrainian side to bring maps from Kiev or to let them bring to Brest. The Soviet-Russian side also did not present any maps and was not prepared to negotiate territorial relinquishments with the Central Powers on the basis of them. One reason might be political reason. Another one, probably the short-term nature of the scheduled negotiations and the limited number of participants. Nevertheless, the negotiations reveal the dynamization of political ideas and spatial relations. If they were not expressed through maps in the peace negotiations, how did they become manifest and more differentiated and recognizable and determinable? It was above all the language, here above all the diplomatic and military language. How the Soviet, how could it be otherwise? That was used as a means. Here I have somehow that you have an idea about Ukraine in 1917-18. The Central Powers did not appear in Brest-Litovsk with a unified position. The German diplomats, led by Kuhlmann's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, took a more mediating position than the military around Major General Max Hoffmann, who also spoke to the other side in Russian and sometimes banged on the table. The old-style diplomat, Austro-Hungarian Foreign Minister von Czernin, led the negotiations in a quiet but determined voice only when the interests of the Habsburg monarchy were being negotiated, and otherwise second the German side. The representatives of Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire spoke only on their own affairs and otherwise remained silent. The German dominance of speech reflected the power relations on the side of the Central Power, and I would like to mention three ways in which the representatives of the Central Powers expressed territorial relations with Soviet Russia. In the first place, and with a view to the negotiations on the territories that Soviet Russia was to renounce, the German negotiator von Kuhlmann shows the somehow cultivated conversation on the right of peoples to self-determination, a topic which had been brought up by the Soviet-Russian delegation. In this way, the comprehensive dictate of territorial renunciation was given the appearance of negotiating on an equal footing of former or of imperial powers, and was linked to the diplomatic customs of the 19th century. Second, in mid-February, when the negotiators were stalling and threatening to break off, negotiations were seconded by military advance through Estonia towards Petrograd, forcing Soviet Russia to resume negotiations. And thirdly, economic agreements complemented the peace agreements, but were negotiated separately with Russia and with Ukraine, so that economic spatial relations supplemented the political ones or became part of them. On the Soviet-Russian side, spatial relations, spatial references were rhetorically manifested in a different way. On the one hand, it deliberately dragged out the negotiations and started excessive talks on the right of self-determination in order to avoid conceding the loss of territories, to delay the conclusion of a peace treaty, and to gain time for the hoped-for outbreak of revolutions in Austria, Hungary, and Germany. Europe and the world were spaces to be revolutionized, and the flare-ups of hunger and workers' protest in Austria-Hungary and the German Empire in the winter of 1917-18 were a first foretaste of the impending socialist revolution. Secondly, the language of the Soviet-Russian negotiations expressed continuities in the spatial image and territorial ideas of the Tsarist Empire. Even before the end of the negotiations, Lenin spoke of the socialist fatherland and compared Brest-Litovsk with Tilsit in 1807, thus establishing a continuity with the relations between Imperial Russia and the old Prussia over the rupture of the revolution. And thirdly, the Soviet-Russian negotiations placed the transition of their former Western periphery into the German and Austro-Hungarian spheres of influence in the global context of imperial colonial rule, linking the right of peoples to self-determination with the global process of decolonization. Ultimately, these were probably rhetorical strategies of self-empowerment in the face of a political emergency. And finally, when Soviet Russia's conflict with Ukraine was worsening in December 1917, it declared war on Ukraine, and Soviet Russia established, with the help of the Red Army, a Soviet Republic in Kharkiv. The Soviet-Russian delegation included 2 Soviet Ukrainian representatives in its delegation, claiming by this its legitimacy to negotiate also about Ukrainian territories. The Central Powers, however, rejected the claim. And here I have tried to bring this a bit together. Those nations on this file, those nations that were not represented by delegations at the negotiations, but whose territories were at stake, were at best able to influence the negotiations indirectly or drawing conclusions from the outcome. Politicization had increased throughout East Central Europe during the war, starting with the proclamation of a Polish state in 1916, via declarations of autonomy such as the one in Ukraine in the summer of 1917, to the federal projects that circulated between Belarusian, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian politicians, especially since December 1917. These were increasingly directed against Soviet Russia, but also partially against Poland, and from the end of 1917 onwards also led to political declarations of independence, as in the case of Finland, Ukraine in January 1918, and Lithuania in February 1918. In Brest-Litovsk, Soviet Russia had to concede territorial losses. The peace treaties placed also the Ukrainian project in a larger international and geopolitical context, thus dynamizing political, spatial relations and conflicts with implications for the great powers and other political projects in East Central Europe. A year later, the political situation had changed radically. In Paris, the representatives of the East European, Central European nations, above all Poland, sat at the table, but Russia did not, and the Ukrainians, who arrived in Paris only as an unofficial delegation from Kiev, were refused partially entry at the Italian-French border on the grounds that they had negotiated with the Central Powers a year earlier. Brest-Litovsk certainly stands in the tradition of modern peace treaties, which were a result of the early modern European state-building process and the formation of great powers in Europe. But it also refers to the change from the old world of the 19th century to the new world of the 20th century since the end of the First World War. Thank you very much.